Freedom of expression was provided for in the first ever constitution in the Maldives, which was short-lived. It was torn into pieces by the people. However, never in the constitutional history of the Maldives have that privilege been abridged. But even a cursory glance at the writings of the past reveals that only on rare occasions did journalists criticize the leadership or talked about its failures. This raises the question as to the extent to which this freedom was enjoyed by the citizens. Whether restrictions were imposed by the authorities right from the start to stifle free speech or other factors were the reasons behind is debatable. One thing is evident. In all aspects, the restrictions and inhibitions that kept earlier writers and journalists from speaking their mind no longer exists. 7 decades after the first constitution, the Maldivian media has taken a different turn, and for the better. Al-Islah, the Reform, was the first printed journal which was published in July 1933, immediately after the Maldives adopted its first constitution. 10 years later, the first newspaper, Sarukar Khabar, Government News, a monthly publication, was launched with Muhammad Amin Didi, who was at the helm of the nation, as the editor. Its circulation was small and people were called into the wards of Male, and the paper was read aloud to ardent listeners by special newsreaders. The paper featured local and foreign news and revealed government policies. Many regard Muhammad Amin Didi as a pioneer of the press and journalism in the Maldives. Tremendous efforts were made by him to print the paper and promote writing.
Algondu handangi, algondu sarkara ventanai, get algondu marung gagan satar solabra hawan. Heren jehuni dunia gear dewan hangura festival. Get hangurama wahakata. Amunna sa khasun anga debu mataka. Sarkar khabar kyun nahi hame? Sarkar khabar, sarkar mein kuch nereti. News nerem begin. Eru chap kura hunna nemme thane. Geta. Etang ki furtama Amiriya chap khana ge namu machangol gandu or Manipur ufeddevi thane. Fahun sarkar etang hippevi benufulu. Hippe etang miki matba'atul hukumatul Maldiviya. Behem bima evi sarkar. Etanga huria sarkar be chape kurne. Adi amilla mi chape kuramas enonta kanu deve.
The first daily, Viefari Miadu, Business Today, appeared in 1956. Press identification cards were issued to its reporters. That was over 50 years ago. Newspapers and journals that came out during the 1950s included monthly journals, Al-Hurriya, Liberty, Fatihugge Ali, The Light of Dawn, Munnar, Minarat, Zaman, Times, and Male Times. Male Times was the first ever privately owned newspaper and was first published in 1958. Newspapers also appeared in the atolls, Tilummati Javvu, Nunu Atologe Rauyu, Views of Nunu Atoll, The Times of Addu, Javvu, Atmosphere, Miduaswaru, Udares, Horizon, and Swadua being a few. 1962 heralded a new era for the Maldivian media. Malay Radio, a private station, began airing programs. It was the beginning of the electronic media. News from home and around the world began reaching the people across the country, faster than ever before. Despite the presence of several newspapers, none of the material was ever critical of the authorities. However, notable changes were being seen in the 1970s. English language newspapers appeared for the first time. Among them were Guardian, Morning Sun, Maldives Newsletter, and Moonlight Weekly. Hafta Weekly, which started in 1976, was more modern and brought new flavor.
Hafta majalla awan bang dharaja no surikam barabod badalekkena dharaja mi zamane no surikam taaraf kori hagiyatuga awan nazaru hafta majalla den awan bang hafta majalla huttale ne awan ekkani den fa Hussein Shihabuge ehi pras eki kuri masakate den awanuge sarkar wazifa masakai burakamu awan hama wagut no libane masaki kura den awanuge ne financial beki ei mustaqil ko minimum kama ke kan tan kure ko banya minimum kama ke beno wetin weliwen ebu ma ke fahum awanuge masakatuge demand bod kam wagut no libane awan ha majbur wi huttala.
1978 was another defining moment, with the Maldives launching its first television station. After Maumoon Abdul Gayoom became the president in 1978, restrictions on press freedom seem to have been temporarily relaxed. Articles, caricatures, and opinions critical of the previous government and its officials were seen. It appeared that these writings had no boundaries. This freedom exercised by writers during the early days of the new leadership wasn't really new to the Maldives. Fresh governments would often allow writers to be critical of their predecessors. This frenzy during Gayoom's first term was brief.
adi nusurikama minimum kama nun kanne avadu sonnane esarkar vettunim esarkar faadu kiya abbay kulen den ifada esarkara faadu kiya kompanya den verikamuge uluwa sarkar ogo befon ekmaka amabada alalu wenonnan den eyruge awon hivani sarkar badalum kuri sarkar onno hurikantaka begotun wahatik liyemu gendi e minimum kama ki awgan gabul kuragotuke yadi nusurikama mionna khayal faakun minimum kamenno ima ei mulin ehim fesege ehim asakkate ehim godakate kam ekan huttuni nama aamugoteke ekagandata baagota ekanta kurumuga kurumude mihunna kurumude mihu fuhiwegen ei taakunta nudihekam ekon fenigen huttale hisab.
Two more daily newspapers appeared in 1979. Haviru and Afatis were launched with the help of the government to help widen the reach of news broadcasts on radio. Community bulletin boards were set up in islands. A strong relationship existed between the government and the people, and the government was able to play this to its advantage, effectively manipulating the media. The environment was not really conducive to criticism of policies. Therefore, it could be said that for the media, the first two terms of President Gayoom's presidency went quite smoothly.
Nawastek adiha hartako nusurikom soti ingeto careful nusurik rakkatrikama ki lianje nusurikam ehme dennevi waki kamaka begotun echelli evijiya ahmada mahala gende wima liunterin liamun gendiyei emihunna elia liumege sababun nurakkale nota undagule naannana kahala kotaka balayage.
1988 saw an abortive coup to topple the elected government. Few Maldivians, with the help of Sri Lankan mercenaries, attacked Male. It came as a shock to the Maldivian, and the people were still reeling from the event when the government relaxed its control over the media. This was announced by the president himself after assuming office for a third term and ahead of the 25th anniversary of the national independence.
Kantata murajaako islah kuruma aafi awltake naalaashnama waagotaki agulmenna tibeveni agulmen amille hadagen ule tottege terega e toshige terega agulmenna banduweven ema agundu miedu beenum wani agulmen amillen hadagen miule toshi agulmen falalafa hama waage tereya nikutuma.
In 1990, the president gathered his consultative council to discuss freedom of the press. A heated debate was held over the laws that govern press freedom, particularly the controversial Article 39 of the Penal Code, which was seen as the biggest obstacle to press freedom. The discussions were still underway when Sangu, Conch Shell, a fortnightly newspaper, first appeared in January 1990. The journal carried writings by most popular writers of the day. However, there were many who were worried about the new freedom enjoyed by writers. A weekly newspaper by the name Ithuru, Friday, followed soon after. These papers were extremely critical of the government. A new wave of writings was seen in Male. Clandestine publications highly critical of government policies were being distributed.
Algun kabul korane warangal maksade ka korevi ulane kame ye faadu kiuma minimum kom noswer kan holwala nunia demokrasi ka magufahi noane e kama bisna fer korevi kame hennamas emme mihige khayal kan nota kan ta hingani ki eta tabbai ga bar මොඩු කරම් පෙසේ මහා මිනුවම් වනිය අවහ බන්දු කොරාශය අවගොනිතුන් එහෙමකින් ආසේ ඉච්චි බන්දු වංචා.
Writings increasingly targeted issues such as corruption, and many officials, irrespective of their influence and power, were being implicated, and calls were made for their resignation. This drew strong support from the public. However, it also spelled disaster for the papers and the journalists. Many were arrested, few banished to islands, and some lost their jobs in the government. Sangu was shut down, citing attempts to create hatred towards the government and failure to take heed despite repeated requests not to carry such material.
එව්වේ සුදුතු වෙන්නේ ඉස්ලාම් දිනක ඉච්චසේ නොගෝ ඒරකෝස්. එන්නම සරකාරු කන්තතක ෆාඩු කියුම් එයි eyruge විස්නු හුරිගතුන් කොග්ගෙම වානිකම්ෙන් නෝකම ෆෙනිගි එෆියෝලතන් අල ෆැෂන්.
We then saw the government coming up with its own paper, Furadana, a monthly newspaper that would carry writings in line with its policies. Hukuru was later to follow the same fate as Sangu. Once again, restrictions on press freedom were put in place, and hopes and efforts of the writers were betrayed.
Raismamon Thagurega work for the common without Toshikan Farada Hanikunashe. Minimum here follow Kurare. Egotan rice could have been Timasaka Gurigan, Algonman, a Hagigatekama Gabulko, Algonman Masaka Ferry. Then Hukur Fermai Colgan engaged the Hitaking a Borikan. Waki Bayagawa, Kaliuvan, Waki Bayakolgan, Navaka, the Kamundiakan. Ingeto. Then you can let a Kuret day, then Hukura Kurin, jehunu Masade, Sanguada, then Sango Fato can negate Algonman to be, then Hukuru. Then I Huria Hamadamati Algonman Hukuramati. Then Hukurues who are the man Sabbath. Then he has Sabbath there or a Grammy Kurasuade Hukuru Sangu Wadiki when he Agunda Navani Hukura Sangu Wadan Jehun Magor Savaki Sarukaruge Minion no Sericame Bavan Sarukaruge Plastericame Netiganek and the Kuranjone.
Various attempts were made by the government to eliminate the ripples created by the type of writing that was seen on papers, Hukuru and Sangu. In 1993, a 3-day discussion to compile a code of ethics for the media ended in failure. Regulations that govern newspapers and other publications were revised. Popular writers were honored, and for the first time, a Writers' Day was marked. The 90s were tumultuous. Political figures critical of the government drew strong support from the public. It could be said that at the turn of the century, the Maldives were ready for changes. An educated generation was eager to be part of what was happening around them and turning to the internet. In 2003, the presidential elections were approaching when rioting in a jail led to fatal shootings that shocked the nation. People were frustrated by the ways the stories were spread by the pro-government newspapers. Freedom of expression took center stage. People found a new and more convenient avenue that would fulfill their needs, the internet. Dhivehi Observer is one of the online newspapers that targeted the government and its officials. This brought in a new culture in writing. After assuming office in 2003, President Gayoom signaled he wants to bring reforms.
Sarkarun Rayutunga Adwaha Rayutuna Golige Masaka Kurumuge Visnung Gangure Ekamuge Nizame Taaruf Kuru.
6 months later, in June 2004, the president announced his agenda for reform, which among other things outlined sweeping changes to the media landscape of the Maldives. The government immediately relaxed the restrictions placed on registration of newspapers. Many new magazines and newspapers were registered. However, things took a different turn. What was seen in these newspapers was shocking. It was as if the writings defied every known principle in journalism. The reasons behind this behavior was perhaps best explained by the Information Minister, Mohammad Nasheed, in an interview with TVM.
Furtamakamaky Agulmenga Bulkoranje Agulmenge Nuserikamge Asas Gulifamenani Dharaja Ganun Asasia. Ganun Asasi Fansavisana Madaga Vara Tafsil Kangabune, Mihak Budia, not a Hiala fennagothah, Dula Galamu, not enumes Gotakun Hial Fal Kurevidane. Tin kamaka hedi gaanunako mana nukuranya rajya gamilla verikan deme hettung islam dinu aslutaraka terkurung ama maslahati fettu migota mi tinkanta manakoffa nusirikam horasale gotaka gaanu ngadi algon menge terekune එහෙම හගීගතව ගාන අසාසී මිහාර කොෆ්ෆේ කමකි මිනිවන් කමුගේ දායරා එක ශලාදිනි මිනිවන් කමුගේ හග්ගු ෆෝර්කොද්දිනි ඒ ෆාසාෆතිගේ එෆර අනේ ෆරාතකි ඒ හග්ගා එක්කොන් අන්නන්ජේ මසූලියත zimma උෆලුම්ගේ ඉහසාස් ඒකේ සරකාරුන් ෆෝර්කොද් දෙවේ නෙච්චෙන්නු සරකාරුන් ෆෝර්කොද් දෙවේනි මිනිවන් කමුගේ දායරා මුජ්තමාගේ තෙරෙන් නූසරින්ගේ තෙරෙන් උෆදිගෙන් අන්නන්ජේ නේ විස්නුමේ මසූලියත් උෆලුමා zimma dar නූසරිකම කුරුමුගේ ඉහසාසකි em ekam alwol men hiwarden ekan kuruma benufulwa beful nan alwol men huriha madade veseba for kodden e nukta devana nukta ki rajya meti badaltake ge terega islahi badaltake war bar speed e gannama meden nusarikam ge daira huluwi media minimum kurevi mi kantatan alwol men kuruma medani maguchaate kandelige mihareti evis yulanus kureifa war bar speed e ehen genda eruga alwol men gabul koran jen alwol men tere mi anna minimum kam mi oleni adi rangalu gotuga balaya gatuma kommesar ka tasarruf nufudigen kan alwol men එහෙම අලගොන් මෙන් කොම්මස්වරක අනේ වගුත් එබ දෙයින් ජෙහෙ රයිතුන් නවෙස් ඉතුබාර ඔතුම නූසරින් නවෙස් ඉතුබාර ඔතුම අලගොන් මෙන් මේ මීඩියාගේ මිනිවන් කම් මිහාර එබ ඔයික්කන් ඒ ඉහසාස් ලිබුනීම දෙන් කුරිය දාර අලගොන් නම් හිවනේ රංගලවාන
A roadmap for the reform agenda was announced in 2006, which spelled out the targets to be achieved to strengthen the media. The whole aim was to provide an environment for free media. Attempts are being made by the government to build an infrastructure to facilitate such an environment. Several bills on media have been submitted to the parliament and broadcasting has been allowed for the private sector. Meanwhile, the frenzied writings that were seen at the start of the new freedom found by the media have now begun slowly to weaken in their strength and disappear.